All right, thank you, Milad. Look, it's my absolute pleasure to host Erik tonight for a fascinating paper that he's got for us on Beckett, modernism, nominalism, and the hidden God. I'll get on to more of that in a minute. Just a quick introduction to Erik before he gets started. Erik is professor in British Literature and Culture at the University of Bergen, in LA University College, Bergen, and he's written some fantastic work on Beckett over the years. A long-time Beckett scholar, leading Beckett scholar. He two of the books that I read some time ago and that struck me were Samuel Beckett's Abstract Drama back in 2007, Works for Stage and Screen, and Modernism and Christianity. He's also published a ton of co-edited works on Beckett, one being Samuel Beckett's Debts and Legacies. That was a Samuel Beckett Today, Wijardhui special issue, and Broadcasting in the Modernist Era. He also co-edited Modernism, Christianity and the Apocalypse back in 2015 and Transformations of Tragedy in 2019. He was the series editor with Matthew Feldman of two book series, Historicising Modernism and Modernism Archives for Bloomsbury Academic. He was director and head of department of the Norwegian Study Centre at the University of York, but he's now zooming in from the University of Edinburgh, where he's currently an honorary fellow of the Divinity School. So the paper he's got for us tonight is one I've been looking forward to hearing for a while. It is titled Modernism, Nominalism and the Hidden God in Samuel Beckett, Wallace Stevens and David Jones. I'll hand over to you, Erik.
Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you, Chris and Milad and the group for inviting me. Really kind invitation. So I'll just dig right in. So the starting point of the talk is an idea that is widespread within modernist literature, that human language is an inherently inadequate instrument for grasping reality. In other words, that its concepts and metaphors are ultimately somehow mere human projections. While the radical nominalism of this position has been recognized in a general way, I will argue today that a fuller genealogical understanding of the theological roots of this idea in medieval nominalism is needed to highlight the ways in which modernist writers like Samuel Beckett and Wallace Stevens still wrestle with a voluntarist God of absolute and arbitrary power. As we shall see, nominalism and voluntarism were born together and remain identical twins. This genealogical perspective also situates modernist radical nominalism as historically founded on controversial theological choices. Indeed, for a writer like David Jones, the historical choice of nominalism amounts to a kind of theological mistake. And the task of the modern artist is, for Jones, to rediscover a God who consecrates and redeems the human capacity for sign making. So this perspective is going to give us a kind of comparative framework for looking at these three writers in context. So the talk will have 5 parts, because it's always a relief to know that we're kind of chugging our way through. It makes us hold in there longer. Okay, so introduction, long shadow of the nominalist revolution, and then Beckett, Stevens, and Jones. Okay, so starting off here. Shane Weller, the critic Shane Weller, has identified a strain of linguistic negativism within modernism that responded to the philosophical language skepticism around the turn of the 20th century by developing literary practices of negation, intending to expose the inadequacy of language itself, a literature of the unword, as Samuel Beckett put it. With reference to Hugo von Hofmannsthal's Lord Chandos letter, Weller points to the radical nominalism that underlies this linguistic negativism. And here's Weller: when the habitual abstracting, universalizing mode of apprehending the world breaks down, there emerge radical singularities that cannot, without distortion, be grasped by conceptual thinking and thus cannot be captured by language, given its necessarily generalizing nature. All of this stuff about language is obviously very philosophically contentious, but this is really more about looking at the genealogy of these ideas, how they spread and how they affect modernist writing. So I'm not going to sort of go into a great deal of detail about the contentiousness of these ideas in and of itself. So the Austrian philosopher Fritz Mautner is another key thinker of radical nominalism for Weller and for Beckett. Mautner was a huge influence on Beckett, as we shall see. And actually, this quotation here comes from Beckett's own notes on Mautner's contributions to a critique of language. So this is Beckett's notes coming from Mautner's as a source, though. The teaching, Mautner expounds the teaching that all concepts or words of human thought are only exhalations of the human voice. Logically consistent nominalism, according to which the recognition of reality is just as much denied to the human brain as the makeup of a surface of stone. And so all thinking takes place in the words of the language, and thinking dissolves into itself when the nebulous nature of words has become clear to us, according to Mautner. And these were ideas that were particularly favored by Beckett, as I said. Weller characterizes the literary project of linguistic negativism that follows in the wake of such radical nominalism as governed by the principles of impossibility on the one hand, and necessity or obligation on the other, since the work of undoing necessarily relies on language and remains a linguistic event. So the idea is that language can only keep pointing to and somehow perpetually enacting the failure of thought and language through language. For Mautner, this radical nominalism is the logical outcome of the whole history of philosophy, considered as the slow self-dissolution of the metaphorical. And for Mautner, the culprit of the story is Plato, whose independently subsisting ideas or forms are seen as empty metaphors. Aristotle, for Mautner, at least situated the forms or universals within individual things, but still this left a kind of residue of inherent purposiveness in nature, which medieval thinkers like Thomas Aquinas connected with ideas in the divine mind. Only, says Mautner, with the medieval nominalism of a William of Ockham does the genuine self-destruction of metaphorical thinking that supposedly culminates then in Mautner's own critique properly begin. The plausibility, such as it is of Mautner's radical nominalism, is thus intimately linked with its rhetoric of what you might call gradual secularizing disenchantment, away from the naive anthropomorphism towards an ultimate self-awareness of the merely metaphorical status of universal concepts, natural purposes, and God. So it's behind this is this rhetoric of disenchantment. However, it is actually possible also to stand this contentious genealogy on its head. What if medieval nominalism itself were the originating theological mistake, and the skeptical obsession with the self-dissolution of the metaphorical its ultimate historical offspring? What if the modernist literary tradition of linguistic negativism, identified by Weller, represents a kind of impasse, locked into an imperative of necessity and impossibility that is ultimately self-generated? A kind of arsenal of recent theologically inflected genealogies of modernity and the secular, as emerging from within the long shadow of medieval nominalism, could be deployed to make this argument. John Milbank and the Radical Orthodoxy School is a major strand here, but in this talk, I'll be drawing mainly on these works by Michael Allen Gillespie and Thomas Fowle. My concern here, though, is not to develop this philosophical, theological perspective further as such, but more simply to argue that considerable literary critical gains could be made by placing the radical nominalist strain of language skepticism in modernist literature against the wider context of the medieval nominalist revolution and its cultural aftermath. So one such gain, literary critical gain, that is that however post-theological the modernist writers within this tradition may superficially appear, their work still remains in key respects motivated by a specifically nominalist and voluntarist conception of God. A comparative approach becomes necessary here to tease out the sharply contrasting ways in which this underlying agon with the nominalist God can emerge. And this will be the focus on my sections on Beckett and Stevens here today. Another literary critical gain is the realization that a competing conception of the ability of human language to grasp reality can and does operate within modernist writing that proceeds from an alternative genealogy of modernity, one that regards radical nominalism as itself a historical mistake. And my example here is David Jones, a writer who explicitly opposed the nominalist trajectory of modernity and drew from that opposition a wide-ranging theory of the sacramentalist, sign-making, and art-making nature of human beings that he tests in his poetry. In all three of these modernist writers, then, God turns out to be hidden, but very far from dead. To recover the specific imaginative qualities of the God they continue to wrestle with, however, we need to revisit the impact of the original nominalist revolution. So, next section, the long shadow of the nominalist revolution. The nominalism of William Ockham and his followers starts from a denial of the reality of universals, essences, or natures as inherent in individual things themselves. As Thomas Fow points out, the consequences of this are far-reaching, since the singular entity is no longer related to an Aristotelian notion of form, but to a process of abstraction. It thus constitutes a derivative concept rather than a real existent. Nature has become something alien, not something in which we always participate, but an enigmatic other to be acquired and remade by the kind of human conceptual labor that, for Ockham and his nominalist successors, defines all rational activity. Our perceptions of the similarities between things are merely that, individual human perceptions, which we can organize into abstractions and label with names or signs, and which we may or may not agree on amongst ourselves. And so for Ockham, says Michael Allen Gillespie, in the absence of real universals, names become mere signs or signs of signs. Language thus does not reveal being, but in practice often conceals the truth about being by fostering a belief in universals. In fact, all so-called universals are merely second or higher order signs that we as finite beings use to aggregate individual beings into categories. These categories, however, do not denote real things. They're only useful fictions that help us make sense out of the radically individualized world. In other words, the modernist nominalism of what Shane Weller calls radical singularities ungraspable by human concepts is arguably already implicit in Ockham's philosophy. However, by focusing only on modern language skeptics, Shane Weller's account misses the crucial underlying motivation for Ockham's rejection of real natures and universals, namely his theological voluntarism. For Ockham, the will is prior to and determines the intellect in both God and human beings. Really existing natures and universals in things themselves was felt by Ockham to limit God's absolute power by obliging him to make use of these natures in his act of creation. On the contrary, says Ockham, God's will cannot be constrained in this way by being bound to essences somehow, because he is free to do anything that is not contradictory. Precisely in order to get rid of universals theologically, Ockham argues that each being is radically individual, directly and contingently created and sustained in being by God himself, without any kind of mediation by created essences. God is furthermore not bound by anything he has previously done, any laws he may have ordained. God is no man's debtor, as Ockham often put it. There is there is thus no unchanging order of nature that human beings may securely grasp through reason. And there is no eschatological plan for the cosmos that God is bound to actually upholding. And this simply generates a kind of frightening picture of the nominalist God that would have tremendous historical repercussions. As Gillespie points out, this God was under no obligation to keep his promises or to act consistently. For nominalism is, to use a technical term, indifferent. That is, for nominalism, God is, to use a technical term, indifferent. That is, he recognizes no natural or rational standards of good and evil that guide or constrain his will. What is good is not good in itself, but simply because he wills it. It's worth pausing to note how revolutionary this position really is. This God could in principle decree that we should not love him, and if he did decree this, it would suddenly be good for us not to do so. By very sharp contrast, the older view of Thomas Aquinas holds that the intellect has priority over the will in God as well as in human beings. God creates out of his own perfect goodness, since he is since he is very being by his essence, created being must be his proper effect. The forms or substances are an inherent outcome of his perfect intellect. As Fowle points out, the idea of God suddenly changing his mind about their value or deciding to redo creation is for Aquinas a contradiction in terms. The ultimate end of creation and of individual creatures within it is inscribed into the natures that God creates. In human beings, the will is conceived as a rational appetite, and its choice is therefore necessarily guided by the judgment of the intellect. Free will in human beings is thus not conceived in the nominalist, voluntarist way as a sheer power to choose between opposing alternatives. Instead, for Aquinas, the will is guided by the intellect's end of happiness, an end which is not itself chosen as an object by the will, but is rather a gift of God's grace, for ultimate happiness consists in sharing his life. So a free will for Aquinas is a will that is not constrained from choosing happiness in this way. So it's a very different conception of what free will means. So Gillespie poignantly summarizes the radical contrast between the God that nominalism revealed and the beneficent and reasonably predictable God of scholasticism found in Aquinas. The gap between God and man and God had greatly increased. God could no longer be understood or influenced by human beings. He acted simply out of freedom and was indifferent to the consequences of his acts. He laid down rules for human conduct, but he might change them at any moment. Some were saved and some were damned, but there was only an accidental relation between salvation and saintliness and damnation and sin. It is not even clear that this God loves man. The world this God created was thus a radical chaos of utterly diverse things in which humans could find no point of certainty or security. How could anyone love or venerate such an unsettling God? Well, this is precisely the question that underlies Samuel Beckett's lifelong repelled fascination with the nominalist God. For Beckett, as we shall see, a stance of ethical rebellion is justified through magnifying this God's cosmic tyranny and arbitrariness in juxtaposition with the suffering, failure, and weakness of the creatures faced with existence in such a world. So moving on, for reasons unknown, Samuel Beckett versus the nominalist God. So for anyone familiar with Beckett's most famous play, Gillespie's emphasis on the arbitrary, changeable, and unknowable rules by which some were saved and some were damned will instantly evoke the debate about the two thieves crucified next to Christ in Waiting for Godot. Our Savior, two thieves. One is supposed to have been saved, and the other, he searches for the contrary of saved, damned. The comedy and the menace of Vladimir and Estragon banter stems from the unspoken assumption that the rules for obtaining one outcome rather than the other are unavailable, and all reports of the event are unreliable, so that sheer chance is really all there is to go by. The confusion reaches extreme pitch in Lucky's disintegrating schizophrenic language as he wrestles with the idea of a personal God, qua, 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 with white beard, qua, 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 outside time without extension, who from the heights of divine apathia, divine athambia, divine aphasia, loves us dearly with some exceptions for reasons unknown, but time will tell. So the nominalist God is here indifferent, apathia, imperturbable, athambia, speechless, aphasia, and utterly unknowable, with the reasons unknown. And his creatures suffer irredeemably. The underlying driver of Beckett's adoption of a radically nominalist literature of the unword is a kind of ethical outrage against any attempts to justify the ways of the nominalist God to men. But as we shall see, this does have some paradoxical consequences. To his friend Axel Kaun in 1937, Beckett described this his artistic project of a literature of the unword as governed by a nominalist irony, an attempt to invent a method by means of which this mocking attitude to word might be put into words. The medium of language itself becomes a veil that must be torn apart in order to get at the things or the nothingness behind it. Beckett's reading of Mauthner around 1938 confirmed these intuitions, and in the novel What, started in 1940, nominalist irony suffuses every page, as Chris Ackerley's annotations show. What arrives at the establishment of a certain Mr. Knott and spends time there before moving on again. He's a servant in Mr. Knott's house. What is a perpetual questioner and seeker, whereas Knott is both enigma and nothingness, and a kind of absent deity figure. And the book is about the immense frustrations of Watt as he tries to apply language to the realities encountered in Mr. Knott's establishment. For Watt now found himself in the midst of things which, if they consented to be named, did so, as it were, with reluctance. Looking at a pot, for example, or thinking of a pot, at one of Mr. Knott's pots, of one of Mr. Knott's pots, it was in vain that Watt said, pot, pot. It resembled a pot. It was almost a pot. But it was not a pot of which one could say, pot, pot, and be comforted. The essence of the pot, capital P, the form or idea of the pot, has become inaccessible to the human intellect, and Watt finds himself in a chaos of never fully nameable particulars, experiencing firsthand the creeping, threatening realization that, as Mauthner put it, all thinking takes place in the words of the language, and thinking dissolves into itself when the nebulous nature of words has become clear to us. And following his tangle with the pot, Watt makes another distressing discovery. As for himself, though he could no longer call it a man, as he had used to do, with the intuition that he was perhaps not talking nonsense, yet he could not imagine what else to call it, if not a man. But Watt's imagination had never been a lively one. So he continued to think of himself as a man, as his mother had taught him when she said, "There's a good little man," or "There's a bonny little man," or "There's a clever little man." But for all the relief this afforded him, he might just as well have thought of himself as a box or an urn. Now, the habit of calling yourself a man is here just a comforting fable derived from childhood, but at the same time, there is no alternative name available that is outside or beyond the particular language we have been arbitrarily taught. The reduction of a man to an it is no more satisfactory. The mention of a box or an urn hints at a kind of living death, for if man has been interred, then what kind of a thing is left behind? But if man is impossible to know or define, what of God? Watt obsessively records and broods over every circumstance in Mr. Knott's establishment in order to discern any legible order. Large parts of the novel are taken up with his attempts to enumerate all possibilities that might hypothetically explain the arrangements surrounding seemingly trivial details, such as the disposal of Mr. Knott's after-dinner slops. And the underlying idea, as Chris Ackerley notes, is that a nominalist God does not communicate his essence to his creation, nor may he be known through the enumeration of mere accidents. Indeed, no order inherent in creation can ultimately be observed, for a voluntarist God is absolutely free to change his mind and to invent new hypothetical words. Accordingly, little by little, Watt abandoned all hope, all fear of ever seeing Mr. Not face to face, echoing, of course, both Dante's Inferno, Canto 3, and St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. To see him face to face. So an infernal lack of any certainty trumps and undermines the eschatological desire for final knowledge and judgment. We also glimpse the frightening side of the nominalist voluntarist God, whom Watt is so fervently seeking. At one point, meeting by a stream in their shared asylum gardens, Watt and the narrator Sam share in a grotesque imitatio Dei of the arbitrary and capricious absolute power of a God whose creation, red in tooth and claw, here appears as the worst of all possible worlds. But our particular friends were the rats that dwelt by the stream. We would sit down in the midst of them and give them to eat, out of our hands, a nice fat frog or a baby thrush, or seizing suddenly a plump young rat resting in our bosom after its repast, we would feed it to its mother or its father or its brother or its sister, or to some less fortunate relative. It was on such occasions, we agreed, after an exchange of views, that we came nearest to God. Now, this is, of course, deliberately shocking and carries an ethical protest against the claims of any kind of theodicy to justify God's ways to man in the face of universal creaturely suffering. As I've argued in more detail in my book, Modernism and Christianity, Beckett agrees entirely with Arthur Schopenhauer's view that such metaphysical optimism is a really wicked way of thinking and a bitter mockery of the unspeakable sufferings of mankind. Like Schopenhauer, Beckett's texts display existence as driven by futile willing and therefore irredeemably stained with original sin, in other words, the guilt of existence itself. This echo is explicit from the early monograph Proust to the novel The Unnameable. We have the phrase, a punishment for having been born, perhaps, and beyond that as well. So it's a kind of echoing theme across Beckett's oeuvre. The Unnameable is indeed a chief exhibit in Shane Weller's analysis of linguistic negation, with its speaker seeking to describe where, when, and who or what he is, and yet in a rigorously Mountaineerian fashion, rejecting every linguistic self-identification as no more than a metaphor that fails to capture reality. But there is also a sense in which Weller misses the theological polemic that underlies this radical nominalist undoing of space, time, and identity. Pressured by an anonymous collective, they, likely those who taught him language in the first place, to have an identity, the speaker is performing a ferocious, impossible act of rebellion against the inescapably theological implications of speaking and being at all. They also gave me the lowdown on God. They told me I depended on him in the last analysis. They had it on the reliable authority of their agents in Bali, I forget what, this being the place, according to them, where the inestimable gift of life had been rammed down my gullet. But what they were most determined for me to swallow was my fellow creatures. They gave me courses on love, on intelligence, most precious, most precious. They also taught me to count and even to reason. Low types they must have been, their pockets full of poison and antidote. Thus, for the unnameable voice, swallowing the notions of identity, historical existence, fellow creatures, love, reason, and the inestimable gift of life finally means swallowing the poison of dependence on God. This the voice will not do, for even if compliance might give access to a providential antidote, acceptance of the idea that all the misery could ever be worth it through some greater good or restored harmony must be resisted absolutely. So in a way, the absolute will of the nominalist God has ultimately provoked an absolute will not. Yet without those fundamental notions, fellow creatures, love, reason, life, historical existence, identity, what remains of suffering? What remains of the original ethical outrage against any possible restoration or redemption of existence as suffering? Where is suffering or outrage even located? Well, this, I suggest, is simply an impasse that Beckett's texts can only circle but never resolve. There is no resolution of this in Beckett. So moving on to the next section, God and the imagination are one. Wallace Stevens as nominalist God. Poetry, for Wallace Stevens, refreshes life. It is an elixir, an excitation, a pure power, as his most famous poem, Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction, puts it. But the transformative capacity of poetry depends on its ability to supply fresh versions of the supreme fiction. The final belief is to believe in a fiction, which you know to be a fiction, there being nothing else. The exquisite truth is to know that it is a fiction and that you believe in it willingly. The influence of Nietzsche's perspectivism and extreme language skepticism on Stevens's ideas is well established. The most apposite and emphatically Nietzschean text here is on truth and lies in a non-moral sense. What then is truth? A movable host of metaphors, metonymies, and anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations which have been poetically and rhetorically intensified, transferred, and embellished, and which, after long usage, seem to a people to be fixed, canonical, and binding. Truths are illusions which we have forgotten are illusions. They are metaphors that have become worn out and have been drained of sensuous force. For Stevens, as for Nietzsche, whatever is believed as truth is necessarily a fiction, there being nothing else. But bringing this process to self-conscious awareness through poetry can bring this exquisite liberation or pure power of embracing a created fiction as belief. To gloss this too in Nietzschean terms from The Birth of Tragedy, only as an aesthetic phenomenon are existence and the world justified to eternity. So there is an implicit Stevensian desire to justify the world as aesthetic phenomenon, which is absent in Beckett, which is more about the kind of recognition of failure. But for Stevens, he wants to find a way of embracing the kind of power of recreation, and that's why he approaches the whole problem of the nominalist God from a different angle. But it is the same fundamental conundrum or a sense of linguistic breakdown. Okay, so Stevens's approach places a kind of immense stress on the power of poetry to name and unname, to propose beliefs and undo them, to create and uncreate, to the point where the Stevensian poet figure becomes an uneasy stand-in for the nominalist God. As Stevens puts it explicitly in another of his adagia notebooks, God and the imagination are one. And the opening canto of Stevens's Notes Towards the Supreme Fiction presents the radical nominalist genealogy very like the one outlined by Fritz Mauthner that we saw earlier. We find a similar history of the self-dissolution of the metaphorical, starting with Plato, whose theory of forms, according to Mauthner, personified abstractions and made ideas into the mother of the world. And the sun here, of course, alludes to the idea of the good in Plato's Republic. For Plato, the light that enables all other perception of reality to take place. So let's listen to Stevens. Begin, Ephebi, by perceiving the idea of this invention, this invented world, the inconceivable idea of the sun. You must become an ignorant man again, and see the sun again with an ignorant eye, and see it clearly and the idea of it. Never suppose an inventing mind as source of this idea, nor for that mind compose a voluminous master folded in his fire. How clean the sun when seen in its idea, washed in the remotest cleanliness of a heaven that has expelled us and our images. The death of one God is the death of all. Let purple Phoebus lie in umber harvest. Let Phoebus slumber and die in autumn umber. Phoebus is dead, Phoebe. But Phoebus was a name for something that never could be named. There was a project for the sun, and is. So Stephen's Phoebe is a figure of the still immature reader desiring entrance to the republic of poetry. But this is no longer possible by proposing authoritative metaphors about ultimate reality, like Plato's sun as the good. There needs to be a new awareness of inventedness itself, the metaphoricity of all our images and the arbitrariness of all our naming. This requires a discipline of ignorance, an active forgetting of past names for the sun, and a shedding of its accumulated associations with the divine, whether as Phoebus Apollo or as some anthropomorphic inventing mind or voluminous master folded in his fire. To see the sun clearly in the idea of it means to see the sun as encompassed by the clutter of human ideas, and therefore also as inconceivably alien from these ideas. The paradox here, though, as the poem openly admits, is that the very notion of a Ding an sich, thing in itself style sun, behind and beyond our perception and images, in itself constitutes a kind of reimagination of heaven in its remotest cleanliness, in its very removal from us, in its purity, in other words. As Stevens would later put it in the poem, The Plain Sense of Things, the absence of the imagination had itself to be imagined. Of course, this is also reminiscent of a title of a short story by Beckett called Imagination Dead, Imagine. So the thought overlaps very much in these two writers, even if they take it in slightly different directions with different emphases. Similarly, in Notes towards Supreme Fiction, the death of all the gods, their skeptical dismissal as anthropomorphic myths, is followed by a kind of self-consciously purple poetic passage, evoking the seasonal slumber of Phoebus in autumn, as if he will awake again, as if the gods are in fact inevitably being generated by the metaphoricity of language itself, and will therefore keep resurrecting in ever new forms. In one sense, this is reminiscent of Mauntner. Again, whatever the human being may dare to do through superhuman strength in order to discover truth, he always finds only himself a human truth, an anthropomorphic picture of the world. However, Stevens finally doesn't go along with Mauntner's relentless negativity, and this is also where he differs from Beckett. The last stanza of Notes tries to make the very unnaming of the sun, the destruction of anthropomorphic images, into a new project. There is a project for the sun. The sun must bear no name, gold flourisher, but be in the difficulty of what it is to be. So this ironic as-if naming of gold flourisher here emerges from within the prior consciousness of the impossibility of assigning any final name to the sun in itself. It is also, again, capriciously purple and poetic, imaginatively rich. The poet can continue to ostentatiously invent names, as long as there is also an awareness that all names are merely poetic. But precisely as such, the poet arguably becomes the truest namer of them all, the one with the acutest access to the sun's being in its inconceivability, in the difficulty of what it is to be. As a consequence, for Stevens, the poet as ultimate namer and unnamer of things comes to stand uneasily in the vacated place of the nominalist God, the God who can make and unmake arbitrarily, capriciously, and at will. Take, for instance, the third section of Notes towards Supreme Fiction, Canto 8. What am I to believe? If the angel in his cloud, serenely gazing at the violent abyss, plucks on his strings to pluck abysmal glory, leaps downward through evening's revelations, and on his spreaden wings needs nothing but deep space, forgets the gold center, the golden destiny, grows warm in the motionless motion of his flight. Am I, that imagine this angel, less satisfied? Are the wings his, the lapis haunted air? Is it he, or is it I, that experience this? Is it I, then, that keep saying, there is an hour filled with expressible bliss, in which I have no need, am happy, forget need's golden hand, am satisfied without solacing majesty. And if there is an hour, there is a day, there is a month, a year, there is a time in which majesty is a mirror of the self. I have not, but I am, and as I am, I am. And the poet here usurps God as the real creator of angels and appropriates their magnificent flight to his own self. Their explicitly projected mirrored majesty for a moment glorifies and fully satisfies the poetic self to the point where he can echo the "I am that I am" spoken to Moses from the burning bush in Exodus 3:14. The expressible bliss of creation through words even undoes need itself, invoking a kind of self-sufficient divine aseity, to echo the terminology from Waiting for Godot before. But the poet's creation of the angel in language is also inherently arbitrary and can as easily be undone. These external regions, what do we fill them with except reflections, the escapades of death, Cinderella fulfilling herself beneath the roof? Paradoxically, by brutally belittling the whole imagery of the angel and the majestic godlike self as a pathetic, solitary illusion by a Cinderella bereft of the fairy godmother, this passage also manages to invoke the exhilarating but frightening power to uncreate at will, characteristic of the nominalist God. Even so, the poet's mimicry of this God's sheer arbitrary potentia absoluta, or absolute power, is of little avail, is itself little more than a narcissistic game of mirrors. Angels, Cinderellas, and even poetic selves here lack any form or essence of their own. So the supposed poet God owes them nothing, not even existence. The godlike imagination in Stephens thus turns into a problem that is never resolved in his poetry, forever veering between tremendous possibility and world-dissolving anxieties. So this is the second kind of impasse that I talked about at the beginning. So I've now tried to identify one impasse in Beckett and another one in Stephens. Thirdly, David Jones, he placed himself in the order of signs, rejecting nominalism and rediscovering the incarnate God in David Jones. The case of David Jones is interesting to me then as a sharp contrast to those of Beckett and Stephens. Jones's root interpretation of the whole sign-making capability of human beings is radically different from the late nominalist predicament sketched here via Mauntner, Beckett, Nietzsche, and Stephens. As Jones's biographer Thomas Dilworth has pointed out, Jones's resistance to nominalism, inspired by the Thomist philosopher Jacques Maritain, the sculptor Erik Gill, and his wider circle of Dominican friends, was foundational for his intellectual development in the 1920s. Neo-Thomist discussion, says Dilworth, ranged through the history of philosophy. With Jones joining in, they voiced antipathy to nominalism, which he had learned of from the Dominicans and Gill. The 14th century nominalism of William of Ockham was responsible, they were all convinced, for much that was wrong in Western thought and culture. They also objected to the nominalist doctrine that the created world consisted only of unrelated singularities, and that universal concepts and names, hence the term nominalism, were empty of meaning. So these are some of the ideas we've already looked at. So here then we have a modernist writer explicitly attempting to get behind and beyond the long shadow of nominalism in Western culture. In his essay, Art and Sacrament from 1955, Jones argues that it is of the essence or nature of human beings to be sign makers and sacramentalists, and hence artists too. Man, he says, sacrament at every turn and at all levels of the profane and sacred, in the trivial and in the profound, no escape from sacrament. Sacrament for Jones means sign making, making one thing stand for another. And this is a kind of, as we shall see, kind of participation in God's creative act. So Jones's perspective here affects a complete reversal of emphasis from the kind of anxiety about merely arbitrary naming and the inaccessibility of ultimate reality that we have discussed before. For Jones, our sign-making nature is not a limitation, and language is not a prison house. It is instead what most loudly proclaims our link to a creator God, for he, like us, creates gratuitously, willingly, playfully, and out of love as a pure gift of his being. Art, writes Jones in this important essay, is the sole intransitive activity of man. That is to say, it's not directed to a utilitarian purpose. It is a fitting together of things performed not for any extraneous utilitarian purpose, but just for the rightness of this fitting together itself. And this, for Jones, contrasts decisively with the works of the animals. It is the intransitivity and gratuitousness in man's art that is the sign of man's uniqueness, not merely that he makes things, nor yet that those things have beauty. For though the spider's web and the honeycomb are contrived by animate creatures, their beauty can be said to be of the same order as that achieved by inanimate nature, the hoarfrost on the pane or the leaf vein. In none of the animalic making is there any evidence of the gratuitous, nor is there any evidence of sign. This making is wholly functional. These activities are transitive. So, you know, the spider makes its web in order to catch flies, not in order to make a beautiful object in and of itself. So by contrast, says Jones, man must be considered a sign maker whose art is sign making, and this implies that man is unavoidably a sacramentalist and that his works are sacramental in character. So Jones means this inherent connection between sign and sacrament literally, for in any sign made by the creature called man, from the very beginnings of prehistory, this creature juxtaposed marks on surfaces, not with merely utile, but with significant intent. That is to say, a representing, a showing again under other forms, and effective recalling of something was intended. This, of course, recalls the Catholic doctrine. This language recalls the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, where the body and blood of Christ are made actually present upon the altar. In the whole sequence of Christ's redemptive acts, from the institution of the Eucharist to his sacrifice on the cross, he makes use of specific signs and forms, and this is an extremely important point for Jones. Christ draws close to humanity precisely by inhabiting and consecrating the nature of man as artist. Something has to be made by us before it can become for us his sign who made us, as Jones puts it in his preface to his long poem, The Anathemata. Or in a phrase Jones often quoted from the theologian Maurice de la Taille's work on the Eucharist, he placed himself in the order of signs. He, that is Christ, placed himself in the order of signs to work with it from the inside. Now, for Jones, the problem with the whole trajectory of modernity is a kind of forgetting or active suppression of the nature of man as artist, ultimately instigated, as we've seen, by nominalism. Modernity for Jones is technocratic, obsessed with devices and machines, and finally obsessed with the dominion of the human will over nature. But as Jones pointed out in the essay called The Utile, when man's works seek utility only, they can appear to become utilitarian in a most derogatory sense. That is to say, they appear subhuman. This juxtaposition of a sense of desolation in the face of the present wasteland-like state of modern civilization on the one hand, and the search for the redeemer of man as artist and sign maker on the other, is the dramatic core of Jones's poetry. And the clearest example is the poem Domine Deus. I have journeyed among the dead forms, causation projects from pillar to pylon. I have tired the eyes of the mind, regarding the colors and lights. I have felt for his wounds in nozzles and containers. I have wondered for the automatic devices. I have watched the wheels go round in case I might see the living creatures like the appearance of lamps, in case I might see the living God projected from the machine. In the long poem, The Anathemata, this core tension is worked out through a dense, cumulative showing forth of significant signs held up or set aside as sacred or sacramental, where layer after layer of the history of Western Christianity and the history of Britain and Wales gets evoked and intertwined by juxtaposition. The first scene of this poem, The Anathemata, is set at Mass. Even by the foot of the altar, the utile infiltration is everywhere, but the odd, out-of-place ancient ritual with its minute palimpsestic symbolism still proceeds. These rearguard details in their quaint attire, heedless of incongruity, unconscious that the flanks are turned and all connecting files withdrawn or liquidated, that dead symbols litter to the base of the cult stone, that the stem by the pawled stone is thirsty, that the stream is very low. The utile infiltration, nowhere held, creeps vestibule, is already at the closed lattices, is coming through each door. The cult man stands alone in Pelham's land. More precariously than he knows, he guards the Signa. In Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, King Pelham is the wounded grail keeper whose land stands barren until the grail quest is fulfilled. As critic Thomas Barinato has shown, this Fisher King motif was connected in Jones's mind with the notion of a diagnosis of modernity itself, of asking the question to modernity. Only then can there be a kind of restoration or renewed fruitfulness. On Jones's reading, in fact, nothing could surpass the eccentricity of the normal life and works of megalopolitan man today and tomorrow. This is not a situation that any individual artist has the power to change, yet authentic art here necessarily becomes a contradiction, a fifth column within that civilization, and here it shares the honors of sabotage with the tradition of religion. For both are disruptive forces, both own allegiance to values in any event irritant, and easily becoming toxic to those values which of necessity dominate the present world orders. The priest or cult man of the opening section of the Anathemata then joins with the modernist artist in an act of lifting up valid signs that is both rearguard sabotage and worship. As Jones puts it in the introduction to the poem, the arts abhor any loppings off of meanings or emptyings out, any lessening of the totality of connotation, any loss of recession and thickness through. It is this immense density of connotation, the sheer teeming vibrancy of sign-making itself that is being recalled and consecrated in the ancient Roman rite of the Mass and Jones's poem alike. So there's a kind of surprising conjunction here between the ancient rite of Mass and this modernist poem as kind of posing different but aligned forms of rebellion against a kind of entrenched modernity and a diseased modernity. The utile infiltration thus cannot ultimately undo the nature of man as artist, and the Mass continues to show forth the whole movement of Christ's consecration of man as sign maker and sacramentalist. Where the Anathemata comes closest to pointing to what a cure or restoration or cultural sea change might look like is where it shows us what it entails to really see all human sign making in light of the Mass. This would mean seeing sacrament as being everywhere and unavoidable, even from the beginnings of prehistory, from the time of the statue of the Venus of Willendorf, say, or the Lascaux cave paintings. Then it is these abundant ubera here under the species of worked lime rock that gave suck to the Lord. She that they already venerate, what other could they? Her we declare, who else? And see how they run the juxtaposed forms, brightening the vaults of Lascaux, how the linear is wedded to volume, how they do within in an unbloody manner under the forms of brown hematite and black manganese, on the graved lime face, what is done without, far on the windy tundra of the kill, that the kindred may have life. The language of Catholic Eucharistic doctrine is recalled in phrases like under the species of and in an unbloody manner, pointing to the way in which the entirety of human sign-making, past, present, and future, is absorbed into the unbloody sacrifice of the Mass, where all times are present. How could it be otherwise if man is the maker of signs? How else we, or he himself, whose name is called he with us because he did not abhor the uterus, whereby these uberal forms are to us most dear and of all hills the most august. Jones often quoted Thomas Aquinas' opinion that the flesh is not an infirmity, but a unique benefit and splendor, a thing denied to angels and unconscious in animals. Here, the sacrifice on the hill of Calvary is strikingly joined with the uberal forms of the Venus of Willendorf, with Mary's uterus as a connecting link. Christ is Emmanuel, God with us, precisely because he does not abhor the flesh and the arts of rational animals, whose sign-making is rooted in the flesh. I would like to conclude now with the suggestion that Jones's poem also offers a generous model for how to approach the long shadow of nominalism as literary and cultural critics. The passage I want to highlight is from the Lady of the Pool section of the poem, whose main voice is a lavender seller in medieval or perhaps Tudor London, an archetypal figure who has seen all that city's comings and goings by water over many centuries. This then is a story about London as a culture built around and upon water, and that necessarily includes a tale of violent domination and expropriation as well. Nominalism turns out to be thoroughly implicated in this from the very start. And those as after them, whose fathers shall relate to them of these old times before them, those as by what new gear and a deal of dials, gins of propulsion, and all manner of contraptions, unguessed even of an admirable scab-shin nominalist, shall know the total compass of the thronging waters and assert regiment of the whale's entire domain. And of these such yet to come, a tidy many from the many hithes of this river captain by and large, some from this here very whore captain, dona eis requiem sempiternam. So we need Jones's note, lengthy note to the poem to make full sense of this scab-shin nominalist, a derogatory epithet once applied to Franciscan friars. See the description of Drake's voyage of 1577 to 80, published in 1628 as The World in Compass. Quote, touching ordnance and great guns, the late invention of a scab-shin friar among us in Europe, with reference to Bacon, known as Doctor Mirabilis, whose 13th century researchers make him a harbinger of methods and instruments without which 16th century techniques and our own subsequent sea power could not have been. In common opinion, if you were a Franciscan, you were a nominalist, and certainly Bacon's preoccupation link him with nominalism and with English empiricism. He appears to be nearer his namesake of 300 years later, that is to say, Francis Bacon, than to the saint from whom that namesake got his Christian name, though it's a long way from Assisi to Verulam. Quite a dense note there, but we find a kind of forward projection of the gradual ascent of technical mastery in the world of navigation, shipbuilding, and sea warfare as we move from medieval England to the age of Francis Drake and beyond. Nominalism is being associated with a utilitarian will to encompass or dominate the world and its waters technically and experimentally, from the 13th century friar Roger Bacon, who introduced the recipe for gunpowder to the West, to those uncompromising 16th century Francis Drake and Francis Bacon, Lord Verulam. Yet ultimately, this note of critique is not allowed to dominate Jones's poem itself. Crucially, even nominalists cannot help being sacramentalists and sign makers despite themselves, and a rich, complex culture imbued with innumerable forms of creative gratuity will build around nominalist-inspired ideas and choices too. Human mistakes, theological mistakes, send us out on particular journeys, establish crafts and traditions and stories worth recalling, prompt us to construct new paths, however temporary, and even our mistakes are never outside of the compass of the prayer, Dona eis requiem sempiternam. Thank you.